Hello and welcome. I'm so glad that you've returned for this second episode in the life and mission of St. Mary Euphrasia. Today we will be talking about the early life and childhood of St. Mary Euphrasia. Of course, she wasn't born a saint. She was born a little girl named Rose Virginie Pelletier. So when and where did she live? Who was her family? What was she like as a child? What made her who she was? These are the questions we'll explore today. As we hear her story, think about the influences in your life. Where did you get the values that you have? Who and what made you who you are? Joining me today is my friend Courtney Lucas, who is along for our story.
Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to get to know St. Mary Euphrasia in a more personal way. Sometimes people who do such wonderful things in life and become saints seem so far away from life. How could I ever live up to what she did?
Yeah, I agree. It's easy to feel removed from someone who lived so long ago and was such a larger-than-life person. But I think you'll find in her someone you can connect with. Maybe someone you could see yourself following or being friends with. So where would you like to begin?
The first thing I'm curious about is when and where did Rose Virginie, or later St. Mary Euphrasia, live?
Yeah, that's a great question and a very important consideration for anyone we are trying to know more about as a person. If we really want to get to know Rose Virginie, we have to see things from her cultural perspective. France in the 19th century is likely a very different time and place than what you are used to living in. We must remember not to judge people of a different time or culture according to our standards. The way in which we understand the world and other people cannot be compared to how she understood the world and people. So very simply, Rose Virginie Pelletier was born in France on July 31st, 1796. Like most of us, she was influenced by her family and the time period and culture in which she was born. This was the time of the ending of the French Revolution.
I know some things about the French Revolution. That's when France toppled the royalty and started a republic, isn't it? I remember learning about the Reign of Terror, the guillotine, and Marie Antoinette.
That's right. So during the revolution, many good people were executed simply for being wealthy or of noble birth or Catholic. But it is true that things needed to change. During that time, the state and the church were very closely aligned. France was a hierarchical society with rigid divisions. The rich were very rich, and the poor were even poorer. The revolution brought about a major change in society, although it didn't get rid of the poverty.
So how was Rose Virginie's family impacted by all this?
Well, her father's name was Julien Pelletier, and he was a doctor. Her mother, Anne Moran, was a very good woman, and they lived in Ceylon with their children. So in their lives, Julien and Anne would have a total of 9 children, but 2 of them, Natalie and Sophie, died before Rose was born. In February 1794, 2 years before Rose Virginie was born, Julien and Anne were arrested in Ceylon and charged with being members of the aristocracy. Their 5 children, the eldest was 10 and the youngest was 3, were scattered to live with their relatives. Their house was boarded up, and Dr. and Mrs. Pelletier were marched by foot approximately 20 miles to an island off the Atlantic coast called Noirmoutier. The island then serves well as a prison colony, so they lived in prison there for about 3 months. Now, can you imagine what this did to the family? Today, we see parents and children being separated from each other, and studies show that the trauma is lasting even after they are reunited. So, the parents were charged with treason, which was being loyal to the church and the royalty, and they were expected to be executed as most captives were.
So were they royalist?
Well, they were certainly loyal to the church, but it's doubtful that they were actually royalists. There were several signed statements from the Republican authorities to prove their patriotism. For example, In 1793, Madame Peltier prevented a troop of Republican soldiers from falling into a royalist ambush. Thanks to her, 600 Republican troops had their lives spared. Well, this may have been the action that ultimately saved their lives. In 1794, the year they were arrested and brought to Noirmoutier, 2,000 people were executed on the island within the first 6 months. There's no record of the reason why they were spared. It could have been because of Madame Peltier, or perhaps the father was a doctor and could be of service to his captors. For whatever reason, they were not killed, but rather they were given a house on the island and kept there as free prisoners.
That must have been a scary time for their parents, being separated from their children. What did they do on the island as roaming prisoners?
Well, the father, Julien, practiced his trade as a doctor, regardless of one's ability to pay him. We know that he was a very kind man. He frequently took in orphans and kept them in his own home, both in Ceylon and on Noirmoutier, until he could find homes for them. The mother was also a woman of kindness. She looked in on the sick and the elderly of the island, and her nickname was the Angel. So it's notable that in the midst of their own suffering, Dr. and Madame Peltier would reach out to others in kindness. This was the behavior modeled in Rose Virginie's household. And so we begin to see where she learned to just love.
That's really incredible. What an amazing example Rose's parents must have been for her. So if her parents were living on the island as prisoners and the children were scattered with relatives, were they ever reunited? When did Rose come back into the picture?
So it was sometime during the year 1796 that the family was reunited. Dr. Pelletier was given permission to go back to the mainland, get his 5 children, and bring them to Noirmoutier. On July 31st of this same year, Rose Virginie was born on the island in the family home, and thus the family was complete, except for the exception of Paul, who would not be born until 1801. The other children were Anne Josephine, age 12, Julien, age 11, Andre, age 7, Victoire Emily, age 6, and Armand, age 5. So you can imagine that she was born into a loving and kind family, and yet a family that had been quite traumatized. The older children were separated from their parents for 2 years and didn't know whether they were living or dead.
What do we know about Rose as a child? Was she always a saint, a perfect child? I've seen pictures of her first communion. She looks so sweet.
Well, she was sweet, but she was not a saint. Living on the island of Noirmoutier did much to shape her character. We know she was a free spirit and that she had a lot of freedom. She could run and play relatively freely on the island's beaches and forests. Much more freedom than a girl born into an aristocratic family on the mainland would have known. She was free from the typical girl expectations of learning to serve a husband, entertain guests, look nice, and manage servants in a home. The island didn't have a formal school until she was 13 years old. So there will be more about that in the next episode.
Wow, running on the beaches and in the forest, no formal school. Sounds like a pretty wonderful place for a child. Tell me more about Noirmoutier. It sounds like a great place to grow up.
Well, to tell that story, we have to go way back. Around 674, a monk named St. Philbert arrived on the island with around 70 monks and lived there for 10 years until he died. He had a huge impact on the lives of those who lived there, and he continues to be the patron saint of the island. The island was named Noirmoutier, coming from the word noir, which means black, and moutier, which means monks. He did a lot to better the living conditions and to teach the people about the Christian faith. He taught them how to extract salt from the sea, a skill that is still practiced on the island today in the same way. He taught them how to irrigate, how to harness wind power, and how to build roads. He built a church and a monastery that held 900 monks, and where he was eventually buried in the crypt. The crypt became a rubbish dump during the Revolution. When Rose Virginie and her friend Sophie were children, they decided to clean it up themselves and they rediscovered St. Filbert's crypt. You can still go there today at the local parish and see it.
That's so interesting to imagine young children cleaning up a crypt of an old saint.
Yes. So she was very religious. The Catholic faith was important to her parents, as is often the case when a religion is persecuted, as Catholicism was during the Revolution. It's held even more firmly in the hearts of those believers. Rose Virginie inherited this love of faith from her parents. And as we discussed earlier, the faith she learned from her parents wasn't one of inaction, but one that moved them to taking care of orphans and the sick. And this is the type of spirituality that stayed with Rose her whole life. So also growing up on the island meant that she had vast vistas of the ocean, and she was a person of vision. She knew that it was a big world because she saw trade ships come and go and heard the sailors' tales. She knew about the slave trade, and even at a young age, this broke her heart. And she told herself that she would someday do something about it, which she did. So from a very early age, we can see her interest in social justice. But we also know that she wasn't perfect and a bit mischievous, and was a leader among her friends, according to her childhood friend Sophie. There are stories of childhood pranks, of stealing an old gentleman's wig while he slept, of washing her feet in the family's milk, and spitting on a bowl of strawberries so that her cousin couldn't eat them. She was taught to think about others. Often she accompanied her mother as she went around the island caring for the sick and the poor. She was also taught to share her home and family, as her father brought home war orphans who then lived with the family while waiting for new homes to be found for them.
So even in spite of her family separation and imprisonment during the Revolution, it sounds like Rose still had a great start to life.
She did. It gave her a very solid foundation, and it would later serve her very well in life when things were not so great. In our next episode, we'll learn more about her as she grows up, the eventual breakup of her family, and the time she spent in boarding school in Tours as a teenager. We'll see her calling to Our Lady of Charity, which was founded by St. John Eudes in the 1600s, and other influential people in her life. For now, I'd like to invite you to consider your own life. What family traditions, cultural influences, and historical events contributed to my becoming who I am? What in my environment shaped my character? What are the defining moments in my early life that have influenced the person I am today? If you're watching these episodes with a group, this would be a great time to pause and share your reflections and your answers with each other. Thank you for being here. Come back soon.